November 13, 1943. This week, it is 20 years since Adolf Hitler marched out of a beer hall in Munich at the head of a mob with the purpose to overthrow German democracy. Those who laughed at him then are no longer laughing now. That is, if they have survived his rise to power. On that anniversary, Hitler holds his last ever public speech in person and promises retribution on Great Britain and the Jews. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus, Olsson. Last week, we saw the Japanese convene with their puppet states during the Greater East Asia Conference. Japanese-American internees in America protested their living conditions. Meanwhile, in Europe, Kiev was liberated by the Red Army, and Nazi horrors continued as 42,000 Jews were murdered in one day in the Lublin district during Aktion Erntefest. In Germany, 4,000 people came to anti-Nazi activist Father Bernhard Lichtenberg's funeral after he died on his way to Dachau concentration camp. This week, the Nazis get rid of more troublesome German priests. Johannes Prasek, Edward Müller, and Hermann Lange are three Roman Catholic priests at the Sacred Heart Church in Lübeck. Together with Lutheran pastor Karl Friedrich Stellbrink, they have cooperated to preach against the war since 1941. They've worked to spread Bishop von Galen's protest letter against the T4 euthanasia program, woven anti-Nazi and anti-war allusions into their sermons, distributed transcript from the forbidden German-language BBC broadcast, and held roundtable talks agitating against the war. Right after Lübeck was hit by a British raid in the night leading into Palm Sunday 1942, Stellbrink used his sermon to frame the bombardment as God's judgment, saying that God has spoken with mighty language. You will learn how to pray again. The Gestapo reported that his words spread through the city like a wildfire, inspiring anti-war and anti-Nazi sentiments. A week later, Stellbrink was arrested, and the Lutheran Church disavowed him and his actions. In the following weeks, Fathers Prasek, Müller, and Lange, as well as 18 of their congregation members, were arrested. After a year in prison, they were sentenced in June this year for a variety of crimes, from infractions of the broadcasting law to breaking the 1934 Treachery Act to damaging the war effort. The 18 members of the Sacred Heart congregation received long prison sentences, and the 4 priests were condemned to death. This week, on November 10th, 3 minutes apart, beginning at 6:20 p.m., they are executed by guillotine at the Holstenglasses Corrections Facility in Hamburg. They are but a few of many priests, especially Catholic priests, facing persecution and murder by the Nazis. During the invasion of Poland in 1939, 3,000 Catholic priests were murdered in the purge of potential Polish resistance. Another 1,811 have or will die in various concentration camps during the war. Many of them are held at Dachau concentration camp in the priests' block, together with other potentially troublesome priests, pastors, and clergymen. In all, 2,720 foreign clergymen, 1,773 of them Polish and 400 German, will pass through Dachau. Over 1,000, 38% of them, will not see the end of the war. As usual, they are murdered or succumb to the camp. But this week in Auschwitz, it is the unusual death of 50 prisoners that heralds big change. Auschwitz Block 11 is the camp jail. In its cellar, the first experiments with murder by Zyklon B gas were carried out on Soviet POW back in 1941. The top floor of the 3-story building contains holding cells, torture chambers, and interrogation rooms. The ground floor contains administrative rooms, the courtroom for summary processes by the Gestapo and police, its waiting room, as well as latrines and washrooms. A door leads out to a walled-in courtyard and the black wall used for shooting prisoners. Back inside, a gated opening leads to the cellar with 28 cells, 14 on each side of a corridor with cells 1 to 7 reserved for female prisoners. Cell 21 is reserved for very important prisoners. Cell 22 contains 4 standing cells, 90 by 90 centimeters, 35 by 35 inch walled-in cupboards that you have to crawl into through a square hatch along the floor. 4 prisoners are forced to enter the cell at once, meaning that you can neither lie, nor sit, nor crouch. The only ventilation is through a 1-inch squared hole in the hatch. Prisoners are kept here as punishment for infractions or as part of interrogation, most times during the night and then taken out for hard labor during the day. At times, prisoners are held in a standing cell for days on end, often resulting in death by asphyxiation, exhaustion, or dehydration. Cells 23 and 24 are the darkness and hunger cells. They are used as punishment cells, either for something the prisoner did themselves or as retribution for some mass infraction. Here, prisoners are kept in absolute darkness, often without any food or water, at times more than a dozen together. They are also used as a means of slow execution, where the prisoners are simply left to die the excruciating pain of wasting away over several days. You end up in Block 11 either because you are a political prisoner destined to be executed or for a number of infractions like suspicion of or actual sabotage, resistance to the camp guards and capos, contact or suspected contact to civilians outside of the camp, possession of contraband food or objects smuggled into the camp, other infractions against camp rules as deemed by the SS personnel at their discretion, and planned, attempted, or failed escape. The latter is more frequent than one might expect from such a hard-guarded facility as Auschwitz. Every week, half a dozen or more inmates try to escape, and on average about a third succeed. Those who don't will be punished and tortured in Block 11 for 3 to 28 days and then released back into the general camp population. Why released and simply not killed? Well, Auschwitz is by now part of a huge, economically and militarily significant business venture, one that needs labor. For the month of October, IG Farben, the biggest but not only client, paid the SS 488,949 Reichsmark for using the camp's slaves. The Wechselunion Metallwerke, a smaller client, paid 35,781 Reichsmark, and so on. To put that into perspective, the average monthly salary in the Altreich, Germany and Austria proper, is in 1943 just under 200 Reichsmark. So, with the money spent, IG Farben would get around 24,000 workdays from salaried laborers at home. Here at Auschwitz, they get more than 6 times as much for their money. 150,259 labor days, out of which 38,410 days are by highly skilled workers. Now, while that might sound like good business, SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, head of the SS main economic and administrative office, is not happy. This week, the camp records show that out of the 72,512 able-bodied work-ready men and women in the camp, 26,617 are currently unemployed. He blames the camp commandant Rudolf Höss, the architect of the terror of the camp and pioneer of the gassing with Zyklon B. Höss might be an expert torturer and mass executioner, but a businessman he is not. Pohl also feels that the excessive violence under Höss' command, as exampled in Block 11, is damaging business. So Pohl has decided that a more suave, business-oriented SS man needs to hold the reins going forward. For that, he has chosen one of his top managers, the head of Abteilung D1 Zentralamt and deputy inspector of the concentration camps in Pohl's organization, Arthur Liebehenschel. The 41-year-old has 4 children by his divorced first wife, and his second wife has recently given birth to a little baby girl. Joining the NSDAP and SS 1 year before the Nazis seized power, he's a veteran of the concentration camps and Totenkopfverbände. From 1934 to 1940, he served under Theodor Eicke, the man who invented the Nazi camp model, after which he has pursued a stellar career within the SS administration. He's a more diplomatic kind of monster than Höss. It was, for instance, Liebehenschel who came up with not mentioning the word execution when issuing awards to the SS men for distinguished service during mass murders, instead calling it awarded for carrying out activities essential to the war. In any case, a few days ago, he arrived at Auschwitz ostensibly for an inspection. He's just waiting for the right moment to give Höss the good news. You see, Höss is being promoted away into a higher position at Pohl's headquarters in Berlin, a cushy office job where he can learn more about how the new business-oriented SS works. On November 9th, the 20th anniversary of the attempted Hitler-Ludendorff putsch, the moment comes. Höss has decided that it's a good idea to execute some prisoners to celebrate the occasion. So he has 50 prisoners with political backgrounds from Block 11 selected, taken to the Black Wall and shot in pairs. It creates some shockwaves even among the SS guards and employees. Even for Auschwitz, this is considered a bit excessive. Höss himself is taken aback by the reaction. Liebehenschel uses the moment to commend Höss for his service, gives him his promotion papers, and takes the reins. In a few days, Höss and his family will relocate to Berlin, but already before that, the new commandant begins reforms in the camp, and especially in Block 11, to end the worst of excesses because it's better for business. He will abolish the standing cells and end the use of the hunger cells. On November 22nd, he will release 57 of the 83 prisoners held in Block 11 into the camp. The remaining 26 had been given death sentences, which Liebehenschel commutes to incarceration until further notice, and he orders the Black Wall dismantled. Inside the camp, he will stop using violent criminals as capos and only allow political prisoners in this role. He will begin pursuing theft of victims' personal property by the SS personnel, actually leading to that several of them will end up in Block 11 themselves. Again, not because he wants to protect the inmates, but because it's good for business. I quote, "The property is state property. Only the state has power over its use. Anyone who makes themselves available of state property is stealing from the state, is a criminal, and will be excluded out of the rows of the SS." Let's be clear of what property Liebehenschel is speaking of, though. The property robbed from new arrivals. Inmates in the camps have very little, if any, personal property. Mostly we're speaking of those destined to die on arrival in the gas chambers. Liebehenschel's reforms follow Poe's directives from 2 weeks ago to increase productivity, and although that might slightly lessen the terror for the slaves, brutality, mass murder by gas, and medical experimentation will go on. This week alone, over 1,000 people from 2 larger transports will be murdered in the gas chambers on arrival. In Professor Klauberg's gynecological experimentation clinic, 387 women, mostly teenagers, will continue to be subjected to hormonal experiments, radiation, and torturous mutilation of their reproductive organs. The new commandant will not end the policy of selection of the able-bodied for enslavement and murder of the rest, but he will try to keep his herd of slaves in slightly better condition, as they are now to be a repository for fresh slave labor to be shipped to where it is needed. Already this week, the transport to Mauthausen are increased. As is the nature of the Nazi German war, most of the victims are Jewish or considered to be Jewish. In the United Nations outside of continental Europe, specifically the British Commonwealth and the US, any relief to aid them by, for instance, accepting Jewish refugees has been largely absent until now. In the US, the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, led by Peter Bergson, have been actively campaigning for that to change since the beginning of the year. They've been met with inaction, indifference, and direct opposition. Even some Jewish Americans are opposed to Bergson's effort, considering it too aggressive, believing it to have given rise to an anti-Semitic backlash. But this week, Senator Guy Gillette introduces Resolution 203, which calls for the creation by the President of a commission of diplomatic, economic, and military experts to formulate and effectuate a plan of action to save the surviving Jewish people of Europe from extinction. Bergson ups the rhetoric, taking out ads saying, "How well are you sleeping?" and "This is strictly a race against death." How effective this will be remains to be seen, but elsewhere plans are now being made for the general aid to be given to civilians as Asia and Europe are gradually going to be liberated. On the same day Senator Gillette's resolution is introduced, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration is created. They will begin preparations to supply food, clothing, shelter, and medical aid, and to rebuild infrastructure, agriculture, industrial production facilities, and essential buildings like hospitals and schools. Furthermore, arrangements are to be made to return POW, exiles, and enslaved people home. Unfortunately for the people of Bengal, British India, they are inside a UN member nation's territory and will not see any of this relief. The new Viceroy of India, Archibald Wavell, has asked Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, to make renewed requests for the long-promised monthly delivery of 50,000 tons of food grains to finally begin next year, and for 50,000 additional tons to be shipped from Australia immediately. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King offers to send 100,000 tons of wheat ready to depart on November 12th. All they need is the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's okay. On November 10th, the British War Cabinet convenes about Amery's initiative and the Canadian offer. But Churchill is not keen to go down this route. The PM's advisor, Frederick Lindemann, has argued that the Bengal famine is a result of overbreeding despite restraints in the availability of food to sustain this population, let alone population growth. During the War Cabinet meeting, Churchill repeats the complaint, saying that the Indians are breeding like rabbits. The cabinet decides that shipping food is futile, impractical, and cannibalizes the war effort. The offer of 100,000 tons from Canada is turned down in order to allow the shipping capacity to be utilized to better effect. The man ultimately responsible for creating this mess, the man who 4 years ago launched the invasion of Poland and catapulted a world under threat of war and already at war into a global conflict, German Führer Adolf Hitler, is rarely, if ever, seen in public these days. Most of the time, he is inside the Wolfschanze, his bunker complex in the forest near the village Görlitz in East Prussia. Here he hides from his enemies, from the bombs, and perhaps from the reality he has created. But on November 7th, he leaves the lair in his private train and travels to Munich via Nuremberg. During his stopover in Nuremberg, he receives his situation reports, has a haircut, meets with General Seitzler, and then eats lunch with his personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann. Before the train leaves the Nuremberg station, his personal physician, Dr. Morell, injects the Führer with the afternoon portion of his daily medicine, vitamins, and narcotics cocktail. The train arrives Munich at 16:10, and 50 minutes later, he is standing in front of a few thousand Nazi followers in the Löwenbräu. It is November 8, 1943, the eve of the 20th anniversary of his failed putsch attempt. When he begins to speak, his tone is measured and calculated, absent his fanatic energy of most of his past speeches.
Knapp den dritten Teil des Menschenlebens umfasst die Zeit, die seit dem Tage vergangen ist, dessen wir uns heute erinnern. Und zu dessen Feier ich auf wenige Stunden in ihre Mitte zurückgekehrt bin.
While reiterating the false narrative of victimhood of Germany in the past 30 years, celebrating the great success of Nazism, litigating his corrupt enemies, and lauding the invincible strength of the German race, he once again repeatedly frames the war as a conflict of the German race versus Judaism.
Es ist vor allem die völlige Schimmerlosigkeit, hauptsächlich Bürger und Politiker, wenn in vielen Ländern getan wird, als glaubte man, dass der jüdisch-plutokratische Westen den jüdisch-bolschewistischen Osten überwinden wird. Nein, das Gegenteil wird eintreten. Eines Tages wird der jüdisch-bolschewistische Osten das Judentum des Westens seine Aufgabe entheben, noch länger heucheln zu müssen. Es kann dann in voller Offenheit die endgültige Zielsetzung bekannt geben. Die jüdische Demokratie des Westens ändert nämlich früher oder später selbst den Bolschewismus. Eines meiner Parteigenossen ist sicher. Ohne den 8. November 1923 wäre die nationalsozialistische Bewegung nicht das geworden, was sie ist. Ohne die nationalsozialistische Bewegung gäbe es heute kein starkes deutsches Reich. Und ohne dieses deutsche Reich, das ohne Zweifel der militärisch wirkungsvollste Staat Europas ist, gäbe es schon jetzt keine europäische Zukunft mehr, einschließlich der unseren. Dass in diesem Krieg wieder England die treibende Kraft war, dass es Ursache, Ausbruch und Führung des Krieges mit den Juden zusammen in sich vereint, entspricht als Wiederholung dem Geschehen des Ersten Weltkriegs. dass aber derartig gewaltige geschichtliche Vorgänge nicht zweimal zum gleichen Resultat führen, ist dann als sicher anzunehmen, wenn sich die Kräfte von einst nicht mehr vergleichen lassen mit denen von jetzt.
The Führer then expresses his sympathy with the German people suffering under a United Nations bombardment, reassures them that the fighting power and industry of Germany remains effectively unchanged, appeals to their fighting will and patriotism, promises that a rebuilt Germany will be a stronger Germany and swift and terrible retribution against the British very soon. He is, of course, speaking of the V weapons, the cruise and ballistic missiles that he plans to rain down over the cities of Britain. In their assessment of the public reaction to the speech, the SS will determine it to have done its job. The long overdue appearance of the Führer in person in a national radio broadcast was what was expected. The promise of vengeance on the British was what everyone was hoping for. By the time his voice is being sent out through the ether, Hitler is having dinner with the Reichsleiter and Gauleiter in the Führerbau, his palatial Munich offices. At midnight, he retires to his private apartment in Prinzregentenstraße. The next day, after having lunch at the Osteria Bavaria, his favorite restaurant, he returns to East Prussia to hide in his lair. He will never return to his private apartment in Munich, and this will be his last public address in person. It is the conclusion of 20 years that began with his violent march on democracy and failed insurrection. A day when Germany looked on with a mixture of mild horror and bemusement. The old Prussian Ludendorff booed out of Bavaria like a hand-puppet caricature villain. Hitler absconded with his tail between his legs, while his comrades unsuccessfully combated the police at the Feldherrenhalle. Goering shot in the ass. A party of brutish clowns that seemed so incoherent and incapable of anything serious that the event was soon forgotten, as Germany moved on into the heady days of the golden 20s. Just another passing shadow cast in a time of deep political divisions, just another challenge to democracy averted. Better to move on, slap the perpetrators with some minimum prison time, and shrug it off for the sake of unity and peace. But 2 decades later, the silly, choleric man with a loud voice and a Charlie Chaplin mustache has long risen from the ashes. Now, while he retreats into his burrow, the world burns around him, consuming both his foes and friends. A world ignited by his flaming rhetoric based on conspiracy delusions, lies, and hatred. It shows us that even when it's a clown posse attacking democracy, it's no laughing matter. Never forget.